If you're someone who keeps an eye on naval news, you might have seen a topic trending over the past week or so. The continued drama of Admiral Kuznetsov, the only Russian aircraft carrier. A ship that's been in long-term overhaul since 2017. Almost a decade later, reports began to surface in July 2025 that the work had been suspended, and that, in addition, the Russians were seriously considering writing the ship off entirely. I normally prefer to not cover ships that are still ostensibly in service. Vikramaditya is the only exception thus far. However, there's enough talk going about in relation to Kuznetsov that I figured a video on her would be a fitting topic. So here we are. Although, as is tradition, we'll begin with the design process first, which is an interesting topic all on its own because this ship is quite unlike any other aircraft carrier. Even her sister currently seeing a much happier life in China. In any event, this story began in 1978. At this point, the Soviet Union had recently dropped an attempt at a nuclear-powered supercarrier. The Oryol project, which went through a couple different variations. It was most likely canceled due to cost, but there was also some political wrangling going on in the background. Regardless, with Oryol's cancellation, the Soviets would stick with the Kiev class at first. However, the desire for a more traditional aircraft carrier was still there, and would, in the early 1980s, manifest in two different directions. The much larger Ulyanovsk, which I've covered relatively recently, and the smaller Project 1143.5. The process of designing this ship began in October 1978, looking towards a ship larger than Kiev, but still conventionally powered, in comparison to the cancelled Oryol and the approved Ulyanovsk. The Soviets intended for the preliminary design to be completed by 1980, with the first ship laid down in 1981. The initial draft would be approved in 1979 by the Nevsky Design Bureau in Leningrad, with the final design approved in March 1982, although the contract for production was actually given a year earlier in the spring of 1981, with the ship finally laid down in September 1982 in what was then Nikolaev, and is now Mykolaiv in Ukraine, as is common to all of the Soviet carriers. On the other hand, the ship would have a problematic construction period. That's something important to touch on after going over the final design. A design that resulted in a ship that displaced 55,000 tons at the standard loading, with this going up to 58,600 tons when fully loaded, at least according to Naval Encyclopedia. As is almost always the case with Soviet ships, that figure varies on the source. You can also see up to 67,500 tons for the full load. Regardless of which figure you use, Project 1143.5 is the single largest Russian warship by displacement, at least when you count completed ships. This produced a ship that measures 305 meters, 1,000 feet, with a beam of 72 meters, 236 feet. The flight deck taking up that entire space. Although this deck lacks catapults, instead favoring her distinctive ski jump. This allows for heavier takeoff weights without the use of catapults, though still limited compared to a more traditional aircraft carrier. On that displacement, the Soviets crammed quite a lot of weaponry, mostly because of the need to circumvent restrictions on aircraft carriers transiting the Bosporus, the Montreux Convention. Those restrictions, in addition to quirks of Soviet doctrine, saw all their aircraft carriers designated as some flavor of cruiser. This includes Project 1143.5, which otherwise doesn't look like a missile cruiser, mostly because her big weapons are hidden beneath the flight deck and bow launch tubes. Specifically, 12 P-700 Granite anti-ship missiles. NATO fittingly designated those the SS-N-19 shipwreck. Project 1143.5, alongside the Kirovs, are the only surface ships to carry those missiles. They have a range of up to 600 kilometers while carrying a 750 kilogram conventional warhead, or alternatively, a 500 kiloton nuclear warhead. In addition to the Granites, the ship also carried 24 8-cell surface-to-air missile launchers, for 192 missiles in all. Those are supported in the air defense role by 8 Kortik close-in weapon systems. Those feature 2 30mm cannon and 2 9M311 missile launchers, so 16 30mm cannon and 16 missile launchers. The number of missiles varies on source, but I've seen 256 cited. In any event, weaponry is rounded off by 6 AK-630 30mm Sea-Whiz guns, along with 2 RBU-12,000 anti-submarine mortars. As you can see, quite a heavy weapons load for an aircraft carrier. Then again, this is why, particularly the Granites, the Soviets didn't call her a carrier. The ship was, like Kiev, a heavy aviation cruiser, or heavy aircraft carrying cruiser, depending, with those aircraft coming in the form of up to 32 fixed-wing aircraft, most often either the Su-33 or the MiG-29K. In both cases, navalized versions of land-based aircraft, the Su-27 and the baseline MiG-29 respectively. In addition to the fixed-wing aircraft, the ship can also carry around 20 helicopters, usually some flavor of Kamov model. Regardless, that just leaves the speed to round things off. Sources will, once more, differ on this topic, from 29 knots to 32. In either case, coming from 200,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts, powered by 8 boilers burning mazout fuel, a low-quality heavy fuel oil which has given the ship her distinctive smoke plume, or as I jokingly say, making her the only coal-fired aircraft carrier. Joking, obviously, because she does use oil fuel. Just low-quality stuff that is probably not properly heated before burning, resulting in a very smoky ship. Oh, and before I forget, apparently her phased array radar is of questionable utility, and I use that term very generously from what I've heard. Horror stories abound. That aside, we've reached the end of the design and design process, so now let's look to service. I'll admit that this section was fairly lengthy, just like with Moskva. But then, just like Moskva, either one really, there's not a lot to touch on with service. In any case, as I noted before, the first ship of this class was laid down in September 1982, though her construction only really began in 1983, at this point under the name Riga, before then shifting to Leonid Brezhnev following his death. Another name change would follow before completion to Tbilisi in 1987. One can argue these constant name changes didn't exactly help her luck, though in fairness, that particular superstition more often applies to ships already in service. Regardless, the ship was launched in 1985, only to face serious delays in her construction. She was only about 71% complete by 1989, still complete enough at any rate for test landings of her air wing. This took place in November 1989, with the final name change coming soon after in 1991. Formally, the ship is known as Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union Kuznetsov. That mouthful, in either English or Russian, is shortened to either Admiral Kuznetsov or just Kuznetsov, with this name change going through on January 1st, 1991. Although at this point, the ship was still incomplete when Ukraine broke from the Soviet Union. Whereupon the new Ukrainian president, Leonid Kravchuk, stated the ship was Ukrainian property and would remain in Sevastopol until a formal decision was made on what to do with her. I should note that formal decision most likely means charge Russia through the nose for their ship. Ukraine was in no position to reasonably operate an aircraft carrier, and almost certainly had no intention to even try. Either way, the Russians were having none of that. They sent the deputy commander of the Northern Fleet to order the ship to sail for the Northern Fleet, which she did on November 30th, 1991. Without any warning to authorities in Sevastopol, Kuznetsov departed for the Bosporus, passing through on December 1st, 1991, without any hindrance from Turkish authorities. Probably because the Russians informed Turkey that the ship was incomplete and not fully operational. Alternatively, the Turks just didn't want to press the issue and cause a multi-party diplomatic firestorm. In any event, Kuznetsov sailed on, with the ship assigned to the Northern Fleet on December 20th, 1991. Although again, the ship was still incomplete. 1992 through 1994 would be spent completing any remaining work in addition to testing the ship's equipment, with her first Su-33s joining the ship in 1993. It was only in late 1995 that Kuznetsov went on her first formal cruise, with the carrier departing for the Mediterranean on December 23, 1995, for a voyage that lasted until February 4, 1996. Though a good chunk of Kuznetsov's time was spent anchored off of Syria. From all accounts, this was a largely successful cruise, with one notable exception. Apparently, there was a water shortage caused by the onboard evaporators breaking down, which is not exactly a great sign, even if it is on theme for how this ship's service would progress. For example, after returning from the Mediterranean, Kuznetsov was out of action for a refit through to 1998, largely due to a lack of funding, which isn't surprising. If you'll recall my Moskva video, her big 1990s refit took so long due to a similar issue with funding. In fact, her own refit lasted until 1998 as well. As for Kuznetsov, she returned to service in 1998. She would participate in a couple major exercises between 1998 and 2000, with the exercise in 2000 being overshadowed by the Kursk tragedy. The carrier would provide support for the salvage operations, though this saw her second Mediterranean cruise canceled. This had been planned for the end of 2000, but the Kursk sinking kept the Russian Navy rather occupied. Because of this, Kuznetsov wouldn't see another voyage until 2004. Naval Encyclopedia cites the ship being in dock for overhaul from 2001 through 2004. I can believe this, as a Russian news article of the time states the following: was last at sea during the Kursk salvage operation and left the shipyard after repairs lasting several years. In any event, Kuznetsov only set off on another training exercise in October 2004, a large-scale affair in the Atlantic, also including the cruiser Piotr Veliki. This exercise, citing the same article, was not a fun one. An Su-25 UTG, a training model of the attack aircraft, crashed on landing, while Kuznetsov herself apparently developed a major oil leak due to rough weather. Aside from a factual error in calling Kuznetsov a modernized Kiev, that article is an interesting one. It's very harsh on the Russian fleet and leadership, which may have been fine in 2004, but certainly not in 2025. I'll link it in the description. That aside, Kuznetsov would suffer another incident in September of 2005. One of the carrier's Su-33s, and I quote directly here, fell from the deck. It was left on the bottom at a depth of over a kilometer. Ultimately, the ship would only have her long-delayed Mediterranean cruise in December of 2007, with this running through February 2008, with a third trip following in December of 2008, this time running through March of 2009. These passed largely without incident, with one exception. On February 16, 2009, the ship was involved in an infamous oil spill off the Irish coast. Up to 300 tons of fuel oil was spilled at the time. Soon after this, Kuznetsov was back home, going in for a refit in March, a refit that carried through until September of 2010. Kuznetsov would then return to the Mediterranean in 2012 for another visit to Syria, by now in the early stages of its long-running civil war. That said, this voyage is more known for two things: Kuznetsov sailing close to Scotland, prompting HMS York to shadow the Russians, as you can see here, with the other note coming in a mechanical failure. Kuznetsov's temperamental power plant gave out in the Bay of Biscay on the way home, requiring the ship to be towed back. And for that matter, the infamous never sails anywhere without a fleet tug thing that shadowed her remaining voyages. That aside, her next deployment, once more to the Mediterranean, came in December 2013 and ran through May 2014. This was largely uneventful, which can't be said for her final voyage to date. This time it came from October 2016 to January 2017. It wouldn't be without incidents of its own, such as the crash of a MiG-29 on November 14, 2016, or the following day, the carrier launching airstrikes against Islamic State forces in Syria. Those strikes on November 15, 2016, were Kuznetsov's first combat action. Meanwhile, an Su-33 would crash trying to land on December 3rd, with the ship ultimately sent back home in January 2017, after conducting 420 combat missions, her first and likely only taste of actual battle. because upon returning home later in 2017, the ship was put aside for modernization. This saw Kuznetsov in dry dock in 2018, specifically Russia's biggest floating dock, PD-50. All well and good to this point, except on October 30th, 2018, the dock sank, with the carrier inside. Kuznetsov is lucky this didn't cause more damage than it did, with the worst of it coming not from the sinking, but from a 70-ton crane crashing through the deck. This left a 200 square foot, 19 square meter hole in the deck. As if this wasn't bad enough, a year later, December 2019, saw a major fire break out aboard the ship. 2 workers died and over a dozen were injured. Despite this, the first of several projected completion dates was given in 2021, with the ship projected to be fully modernized by 2023. Her electronics, flight deck, and power plant would be replaced. That last one being quite necessary for continued service. As I'm recording this in 2025, you can guess how that went. The ship wasn't dry docked again until May 2022, resulting in the completion date being pushed back to 2024, with another fire breaking out on December 22nd of 2022. Because of this, Kuznetsov only left dry dock on February 21st, 2023. How much work has actually been completed is something of an open question, not least because access to information is difficult to obtain. What is clear is that the ship hasn't returned to service, which has fueled the ongoing rumors since the start of July 2025 that the ship is going to be retired. Reasons for this vary, often coming down to the age, poor condition, and the ever-increasing cost of the overhaul, as well as the crew being conscripted for service in Ukraine. All of these are valid points. The ship is old. She's almost certainly in poor shape after the repeated accidents, and I shudder to think of the cost. Less valid is comments by the former head of the Pacific Fleet that aircraft carriers are useless and drones are the way of the future. In any event, the argument that Kuznetsov will be scrapped is one I wouldn't be surprised by. The ship has spent more time in refit than in service, and Russia isn't exactly swimming in spare funding at the moment. It's a stark contrast to her sister Varyag, long incomplete, but currently quite useful to the Chinese Navy. But that is a story for another day. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.